Welcome back to TAC Ops. I'm Greg, better known as Covert Cabal. With me, as always, I have Eric Marino.
Howdy, howdy.
Today we have Josh Dean on the podcast. Josh is an author. He's written many books on military topics and history. Thanks for being with us, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so do you want to start out by introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm a author and journalist based in Brooklyn. Probably most relevant topic. My last book was called The Taking of K-129, which is the story of Project Azorian, this incredible true life account of the CIA's partially successful attempt to steal a Russian nuclear ballistic missile submarine back in the Cold War. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that. But one of the wilder, if not the wildest, covert operation that we are aware of, certainly during the Cold War, back when the CIA used to do really insane stuff. I mean, I'm sure they still do. We will find out about it in decades. But, I mean, the scale was just big back then.
Yeah, that's always the problem. We don't find out this stuff until we get older. But it's always interesting, though. That K-129, that's got to be one of the most interesting stories from the Cold War.
Yeah, it's a crazy, crazy story. It's one of those things that, like, you know, a lot of people haven't heard it, but even people who were aware of it are kind of like, did that actually really happen? Or was that just like a legend from intelligence history? And I guess part of the nature of intelligence, and this is probably something the CIA likes, is that you never know what's true and what's not true. I guess that's why it works. If you're really good at covert ops, then the fact that people are always a little confused about where the line between reality and make believe is, like, that's kind of the point. And you know, this book, like, even when I tell the story now, people kind of can't believe it really happened.
Yeah, I'm one of those people. It took me a while. You know, after getting out of the Navy, I was into submarines for almost 5 years before I realized that was like an actual thing. Like, I had heard stories about it, but it didn't really make any sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's just wild. I guess for the people who don't know, who are listening, I should probably explain what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, if you want to, yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you want to start from the beginning, give a rough overview of what happened, why it happened, etc.
Yeah, so basically in 1968, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine, K-129, a Golf-class submarine for the sub nerds who are listening, not state-of-the-art, but had been refitted with some state-of-the-art capabilities. It was the first Soviet submarine that could launch its missiles from a submerged position, which, as Eric knows, I mean, when Eric was in the Navy, all the subs could fire from a submerged position, but that wasn't always the case. There was a time when, you know, when boomers were new, they had to come to the surface, and coming to the surface when you're a submarine is bad, right, Eric?
Yeah, yes, sir. And then they can see you up there. You gotta stay hidden.
You gotta stay hidden. That's the whole idea in submarine warfare, is staying hidden. So the submarine sinks out of the Pacific Fleet base on the west coast. I guess that would be the east coast. Sorry, of Russia. Soviet Union is gigantic. So we're talking the Kamchatka Peninsula. It sinks out for mysterious reasons. I mean, we can talk about this later. We're still not sure, or those who might know for sure what happened have never told the truth about it. But anyway, it sinks in very deep water, almost 16,000 feet. And the Soviets lost it, basically. They mount this massive search for it, which is observed by various platforms, U.S. Navy platforms. Very clear they're looking for something, pretty obvious what they're looking for, a submarine that was lost. And then eventually they abandon the search. They just can't find it. And you can imagine, you know, we're talking late 60s. 16,000 feet today in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is a very daunting ask. But back then especially, if you didn't know exactly where it was, almost impossible to find. And I don't think the Soviets at that time had very capable deep water search anything. It's not like we did either, but at least we had some tools that could get to the bottom of the ocean. So once the Soviets abandon the search, the Navy goes looking for it, using data from the acoustic sensor SOSUS network, which we can also talk about because it wasn't exactly SOSUS, but basically acoustic sensors hooked up to the SOSUS network. Triangulate the position of the submarine and then ask the question, could we get it? Would have been an unprecedented intelligence haul to get a hold of like intact nuclear missiles plus crypto gear and even just a submarine. I mean, we would have had no idea what their subs looked like or were built like, and vice versa. It's the kind of thing, if you can get a hold of it and then do it without them knowing about it, it's sort of the score of the century. And so the Navy locates the sub, goes back to the Pentagon. This conversation breaks out. What do we do about it? Could we get it? And if we can get it, who should get it? The project is handed to the CIA because the CIA was good at doing things in secret and doing things fast. They had just built the U-2 and the SR-71. They had proven that they could do things really fast, really audacious, and in secret. The Navy can do amazing things, but not quickly, and they tend to be very expensive. Certainly not in secret on that scale. So the CIA gets this project, and they mount this incredible mission to go and pick the submarine off the bottom of the ocean. Of course, there's a big wrinkle that they got to do it in secret, and the way they do it in secret is by using Howard Hughes.
And Howard Hughes was that eccentric multi-millionaire back in the day. He made some ridiculously expensive movies. I forget the name of what was the aircraft? The Spruce Goose.
The Spruce Goose, yeah.
Right. That huge aircraft. So he was a good cover story to use, right?
Yeah, so the Spruce Goose was made out of wood. It was the largest airplane at the time, the largest airplane ever built. And so he just decides during World War II, metal is at a premium. It's all going into various things, battleships and basically everything. Metal is the most important thing we have during the World War II. And he thinks, well, we don't have to make airplanes out of wood. They used to always, they don't have to make them out of metal. They used to be wood. They could be wood again. And if I make it big enough with big enough wings, and strong enough motors, I could make this gigantic wooden airplane that will ferry troops and gear across the Atlantic. And so he builds the Spruce Goose, and it really only flew once, and it got I think 100 feet off the surface of the ocean, and then never flew again, and became this kind of white elephant project that was just a novelty. But he was known for doing just crazy, crazy shit. And he was eccentric and was a huge patriot, had worked with the CIA on some other things. And so when they went looking for a cover story, we'll probably talk a little bit about the engineering. So they come up with a method for grabbing the submarine, which is to use a gigantic ship with a claw at the bottom, dangling at the bottom of a 3-mile long steel pipe string. So, basically like the arcade game with the claw that picks up the teddy bears. It's like that. But in this case, it's a 2 million pound submarine. You can imagine the scale of the ship and the machinery we're talking about. So they're like, okay, we think we can do this from an engineering perspective, maybe, but that's going to be sort of obvious if we park a giant ship out in the middle of the ocean where there's not usually a ship parked. That's going to kind of set off some alarm bells with the Soviets and everybody else. So we need to explain what that thing is. And they're like, what if we say it's a mining ship? And that mining ship is owned by Howard Hughes because he's crazy. He would do that. And it wasn't like mining at the bottom of the ocean was an invention. They were talking about doing it. I mean, we're still talking about doing it today. No one's really successfully done it to this day, but it wasn't a crazy story. It was believable. And Howard Hughes, the Hughes company, agreed to do it. So they basically, for 4 years while they prepared this engineering project, went out and convinced the world that Howard Hughes was going to mine the ocean. And it worked. I mean, everybody believed it. It was like I could show you stacks of media stories from every magazine and newspaper in the world, TV stations, talking about Howard Hughes and his crazy mining company.
Yeah, it was such a great cover story, man. Like, he was so eccentric at the time, and he got real reclusive. Like, that was the other thing, was like he hid, so nobody could ever talk to him. Like, nobody could even really ask him anything about it because of how reclusive and weird he had gotten in the end.
Totally, yeah. I mean, late in his life, and this was late in his life, so we're talking sub sinks in 68, project is greenlit in 69, engineering starts really in 70. Yeah, he's like living at the top floor of the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, depending on which story you believe, hopped up on opiates, essentially soiling himself, watching his own movies. But he had he was still aware of what was going on, and he had this group. They called him the Mormon Mafia. So all of his top lieutenants were Mormons, and they were all great patriots, and they kind of ran the companies. I mean, he knew what was going on, but he also trusted them to make decisions, and these guys all signed on to this. But you're right, Eric. I mean, like, Howard Hughes didn't give interviews. You didn't even know where to find him. Everybody thought he was crazy. So it was almost like the perfect guy to do this with, because everybody, I mean, nobody would doubt anything Howard Hughes did. And even if you did doubt it, how you could never get an interview to sort of call bullshit on him. So essentially you've got this guy who's almost like written for the script. And I think maybe it couldn't have worked with anybody else. You couldn't have done it with a public company because, then you'd have to lie to your shareholders and you'd cause all kinds of problems. Most private people would be up, not comfortable with it. But here you got a rich guy who would do anything. And it really worked. I mean, that's the most remarkable part of the story, is that they for 4 years fooled the world into thinking that Howard Hughes was mining the ocean.
That depth still blows my mind. So you said 17,000 feet.
16,500, I think.
So that's like, what is that, like 5 kilometers? Right around there?
Yeah, 3 miles. Yeah, 3 miles. Basically 3 miles, 5 kilometers. I mean, obscene. I mean, very few humans have been to that depth today. There's not a lot of machinery today that goes to that depth. Certainly nothing that could pick up 2 million pounds. So that's like, I mean, you got two amazing
That's
stories.
the other part too, yeah.
Yeah, you've got like the CIA, the covert part, which is creating a lie that the whole world believes, and that's pretty amazing. But then you got the engineering story, which is like, again, we're talking late 60s, early 70s, pre-computers. So using like graph paper and slide rules. They didn't even really have calculators. And they build this ship with this incredible system that deploys this claw to the bottom of the ocean that can pick up 2 million pounds. I mean, like, if you asked a company to do that today, they might tell you it was impossible.
Yeah, and that's the incredible thing. So when you look at pictures of the ship there, the Glomar Explorer, I mean, it's a big ship, but it's, like I said, it still just blows my mind how they can pick up something, you said 2 million pounds, from 5 kilometers under the surface of at the bottom of the ocean. It's just incredible. But you said with no computers or anything, so I guess that can kind of lead us into the next part. The plan did not quite go according to plan, did it?
Well, I guess it depends on how you look at it. People always ask me, was it a success? Was it not a success? So essentially, it works. They fool the world. They build this gigantic ship. We're talking almost the size of an aircraft carrier. It sits out there in the middle of the ocean. And I should say that, like, because it was really complicated and expensive, as you might imagine, there's also really no way to test it. It's not like you could go out and pick up something else that weighs 2 million pounds that's 3 miles down in the middle. Like, they sort of had to hope that it was just going to work the first time, which anybody who works in engineering would be like, that's not exactly an ideal situation for something that cost, like, in today's dollars, who knows how many billions, and took 4 years and thousands of people. And we don't know exactly how much it costs, because it's not like the CIA releases spreadsheets of their projects.
Yeah, even their budget is classified still to this day.
Exactly. So there's, I think when the project started, they gave it like a 10% chance of success. By the time the mission like deployed, they were giving it about a 50% chance. So it all works. The claws deployed. Some Soviet ships actually come out to the site and harass it. They're not sure what it is, and it seems like they believe the cover story, but they still acted very erratically, and there were some tense days. But these ships go away, and in the end, the whole system works. They hook the submarine. And this claw, I should say, it's, again, we're talking early 70s. It's got like real-time video telemetry. It's got side scanning sonar. They're flying it. They had a simulator on board. I mean, just like bananas technology for early 1970s. And it all works. They picked the submarine off, but about a third of the way up, so 5,000 feet off the bottom, one of the fingers if you can imagine, the claw had fingers like on your hand. One of those fingers snapped under tension, and part of the submarine fell back to the floor. Unfortunately, the part that fell back to the floor was the part that had the missiles in it and the crypto gear. So they ended up pulling up about a third of it. So all of the engineering worked and the cover story worked, but there was a metallurgical flaw. Again, they'll debate till the end of time what actually went wrong. Global Marine, which built the ship, blames Lockheed actually built the claw. They chose the steel. It seems like it was probably the wrong steel that was used. So anyway, they get like a third of the sub, and it's not the most important third. I think you can consider it success in a lot of ways, and actually, a lot of people in the Navy I talked to still said that 1/3 was incredibly valuable, just in things that were learned. But it wasn't. We didn't get the nukes. We didn't get the crypto. We did seriously ding Soviet morale, I think, and also probably got some intelligence guys decapitated or sent to gulags. When the story breaks in the media a year later, and the Soviet leadership is like, "Wait a second, you let the Americans find our submarine and then sit out there for a month over the top of it and then pick it up and sail away, and we didn't even know about it."
Yeah.
You can imagine how that went over with fleet intelligence.
So the story actually was almost leaked to the press, right? Wasn't there a break-in at Howard Hughes's office?
Yeah, so there's some mysteries, enduring mysteries, even 40 years later, that are not it's not entirely clear exactly how this happened, but the story does leak to the media in 1975. So after that failure, if you want to call it that, they were going to go back and get it because it seemed like the cover story had held up. So Global Marine took over the claw engineering, and they were going to redo it with a new steel. And go back. But during that, about a year later, while they're working on the engineering, the story leaks to the media. And the CIA managed to squelch it for a while. Actually, the DCI, Bill Colby at the time, went to editors of newspapers, and it leaked, I should say, in the LA Times. It ran on, but it didn't run on it did run on the late edition front cover. They had a bunch of facts wrong. They put it in the Atlantic Ocean. Various things were like wildly incorrect, but the broad strokes were right. It was basically CIA's trying to steal the submarine, and it did name the Glomar Explorer. So Colby goes to all these editors and says, this is a matter of great national security. We may still go back and do this again. I urge you, please don't report on this anymore. All the other newspapers agreed to sit on the story. The LA Times doesn't run anything else, and it seems like it works. Basically, the Soviets don't react in any way, and it appears to work. Everybody agrees to sit on it except for this one radio guy named Jack Anderson, who is a kind of maverick figure. And he's just like, this is a boondoggle. You've spent hundreds of millions of taxpayer money. I refuse to sit on this thing. And he announces it on his radio show, and that kind of blows the follow-up mission. And how that all started is a little unclear. The break-in, there was a break-in at a Hughes office in LA. Some papers were stolen. CIA panics, thinking for some reason they think that one of the papers stolen may be a contract that basically illustrates the relationship between the CIA, Howard Hughes, Global Marine, essentially all the real structure of the operation, not the public. Like it would say, like, Howard Hughes, you're going to pretend to do this thing, but this is really what we're doing. It's unclear if that paper ever was actually stolen or if it was just cross signals, but the guys who stole it then, like, Keystone Cops try and sell the stuff back to the Hughes, and the FBI attempts the sting, and it kind of all goes sideways. But the paper is never found. But in the course of all of that happening, some reporters at the LA Times end up hearing about the fact that the CIA is freaking out about this thing, because somebody at the LAPD said, like, CIA thinks these guys got some papers that are going to reveal this mission that they're on. And that's what seems to have started it. But it's unclear, actually, if that paper ever existed. So it may have been this giant misunderstanding, actually, that did it.
Huh. Was that break-in before the mission? I think I got my timelines confused here. Was it before they actually went out to pick up the submarine?
No, it would have been in the subsequent year.
Okay.
But there's a year afterwards in which the cover story continued to hold, and they were going to go back and do it again. I mean, they were well underway re-engineering the claw. and the Glomar Explorer had been modified a little bit. They'd changed the crew up. They were going to put a new mission director on it. Probably some of the engineers would have been different, but basically everything was rolling forward when this all happened.
That's interesting. I did not know that they were planning to go back and recover it.
Yeah, they renamed it. So the original operation was called Project Azorian, and then this was the follow-up mission codenamed Project Matador. And the claw had been rebuilt. They went to a new steel company. I can't remember exactly where. And they trucked these claws were built on the East Coast somewhere, because I remember someone telling me the story of these. The claws were gigantic. I mean, you can imagine how big this thing is if it could pick up a submarine. Each one was on its own semi-trailer, and they had to bring them across like in the middle of the night under very secret conditions to get them to the factory to have them assembled into a claw. But all that was underway. It was like a green light going forward mission when Jack Anderson blew the story.
Interesting. I always wondered, do you know what happened with the section that they did recover? Did they just disassemble it and, go through and try to measure everything and get as much information as they could out of it? Whatever happened with that section?
Well, so they began exploitation immediately on board the ship. So everyone who had been on the mission, whether you were a CIA officer, like a Livermore scientist, or just like a grunt oil worker, were all put through exploitation training. So they all went up to Redwood City, California, and they practiced on a fake wreck. Because the crew wasn't. It was a big crew, but it wasn't like we could afford to have like a separate exploitation crew versus working crew. So everybody had a job. They were taught how to put on the nuclear gear, the suits to protect themselves. They were taught how to weld and use arc welders and torches and photography gear. So they actually started cutting into it immediately. And then there were like specialists, like nuclear specialists, photographic specialists, Navy sub guys who could look at stuff and say, that's what we want to keep. That's not important. And then they were throwing stuff overboard that was not important, like big pieces of metal that they didn't think they need. And then boxing things up that they felt were important. And as soon as the ship got into Lahaina, Hawaii after the mission, some stuff I was told was immediately put in briefcases and boxes and taken away by guys in dark sunglasses. And then
the Men in Black.
Exactly. The Men in Black took away the most important stuff. And then the larger sections were taken to naval base, subbase Kitsap up in Washington. So Kitsap, I did this reading last fall at the Naval Undersea Museum up there, and afterwards, a couple old timers came up to me and were like, because I didn't say during the talk that's where it happened. I wasn't sure how public that was. It's fairly public up there, I think, now. And a couple people came up afterwards and they were like, where that stuff went, right? And I was like, yeah, I do. It was nearby here, right? And they're like, yeah, we were. People who were on the base at that time. There, I think essentially was a section of the base that was dedicated to that, probably some, hangar or warehouse. And then the CIA actually based some people up there for a while they picked it apart. And then as for where it is now, I don't know. I'd love to know. I always assumed they probably took some stuff to Area 51 because it was dry, and when in doubt, they could always take stuff there.
Interesting. And I remember hearing also they actually, like you said, they recorded everything and they made a whole documentary about it, but nothing has been released, right? No pictures, videos.
No, there's never been any. The only video that's been released, and you can watch it on YouTube, is they did a burial at sea for the remains of the Soviet submariners that were brought up. So no intact bodies, but there was material found, crushed in the submarine. So,
oh yeah,
they had essentially a morgue on board. They're prepared for that. They didn't know what they would get. They thought they might get fairly intact bodies because it was so far down. That's very cold water, low oxygen water. So things get really well preserved. So they had a morgue on board. They didn't get. I think they got pieces, but essentially they put them all into caskets and they designed a whole burial at sea ceremony that you can watch on YouTube. And a Soviet naval defector had actually consulted on that, so they had a whole program, Soviet naval ensign. They played the national anthem. They gave this sort of fairly moving speech about, someday we hope that our two countries won't have to go to such lengths, and essentially these are our brothers in some way. And then they buried them, and you can watch that on YouTube. Other than that, no, there's never been any. I have some video that a guy gave me of the cameras, the video feed from the Claw. The Claw was known as Clementine. That was his nickname. So I've got some actual video. It's pretty grainy, but it just shows kind of the sub sitting on the seafloor. But I've never seen anything from inside the ship, like while they're cutting it apart or where it went or what they found. There's never been an accounting of exactly what was recovered. So the CIA did admit in the 70s they got some nuclear tipped torpedoes, which apparently we did not know that they had. And that's interesting because as I was told later, it kind of changed the way that some Navy CIA people looked at the Cuban Missile Crisis, that standoff off of Cuba. If you remember the story of the submerged Soviet submarine that couldn't reach, they had no way to communicate with their headquarters. The U.S., we've got, I don't know if they're battleships or what, essentially blocking their way to Cuba.
Yeah, that was the Foxtrot submarines that tried to make it down to Cuba. Yeah, they ended up not making it because they overheated.
Yeah, right. And so, Eric, if I'm right, they were submerged, and the captain had to make a decision, like essentially start nuclear war or not, because he can't reach base for orders, right? So he's got to decide: do I surface and follow? Let the Americans turn us around, or do we fire on their ships and go where we're supposed to go, right?
Right. Yeah, definitely. There was arguments on board, and I think I can't remember how it went, but I think the captain was like, "We're gonna do this," and they kind of overrode him, and they're like, "No, we're not gonna do this."
Yeah, and I think in history, kind of like credits that captain now with like potentially saving the world from nuclear war. But I think what we didn't know is that the subs had nuclear tipped torpedoes. So had they fired upon our battleships, we're talking a different situation than if those had just been conventional torpedoes. Obviously, in either case, it's a serious escalation. But if you shoot a nuclear torpedo at a battleship, the situation probably gets even hairier. And I think we did not know that until the K-129 that they had that in their capabilities.
Right, and I think what else is really important about that is when you hear the story, people are like, yeah, they got nuclear tipped torpedoes, like whatever, we've had those for a long time. But I think what's really important about it is that this is kind of the first time that we've had something like that in our hands, where we can see how they built the casings and they built the weapon, and you could see you can look at that stuff and you can find the technicalities of it.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Like, people are like, why would we, why do we care so much about the missiles? We observe their missile tests. We're spying on them all the time, but not really. I mean, you would never have the chance to up close look at a nuclear package, like what warhead design or what the fissile material is like, or, how are they detonating them? What kind, what are they using exactly? That's all crazy classified to this day. I mean, I was trying to interview some nuclear physicist who worked for us during the Cold War, just to say, like, can you explain to me exactly what we would want to learn? And they're like, that's a really hard question for me to answer without like revealing things that I'm not allowed to reveal to you already. Like, wow. Because I was like, talked to one who was a chemist, and I said, well, these guys were really worried about bringing these nukes on board and what could happen. Would there be some reaction? What if something fell? Could one blow up? And she was like, I can't really tell you exactly why this is true, but they wouldn't need to worry about it. I mean, the fact of the matter is they're designed only to blow up under very specific conditions. I mean, we famously dropped a hydrogen bomb accidentally on Spain, and it just kind of bounced off some farmer's field, right? Like, if they blew up when they made contact with land or when they were exposed to air, then there'd be a lot more accidents. I mean, I actually fell down this rabbit hole recently of reading about nuclear accidents that happened over the last 50 years, and there's some pretty terrifying stuff.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of nukes by accident.
And those are the only ones we know about, too. You always wonder about the Soviet Union. They were not quite as open about incidents. So do we even know? The name for those are called Broken Arrow, right?
Broken Arrows, yep.
That's correct. Okay. I'm sure they had some incidents as well, right?
Oh, yeah, they've had. I mean, I was actually, one guy wrote to me about the book was on the U.S. He was a Navy EOD guy who was on the U.S. Nest team. If you know, Nest is our secret nuclear. What's it stand? I can't remember exactly what it stands for. Basically, when there is a rogue or a nuclear event transpires somewhere in the United States, it's a combination of like, you know, JSOC, nuclear physicists, EODs, like all the people who you need when something terrible is about to happen with a nuclear weapon somewhere. And he said, you know, there have been pretty well documented cases of broken arrows in the United States. Like there have been books about them. We're very forthcoming about it, even if we're slightly embarrassed. But he's like, I think the Soviet Union is like probably a gold mine of stories because they don't tell. I mean, they didn't tell anybody what happened to the K-129. They didn't tell the families for like the true story for decades. I mean, they had no accountability in the Soviet Union to really be honest with anybody. You know, forget the public. We're talking about the families in some cases. So you can only imagine the stuff that went on. Also, the value for life at that time during the Cold War, arguably even today, is different. You know, they don't consider losing a submarine nearly as much of a disaster as we do. Obviously, it's a terrible thing there, but like here, it's like a national crisis. We would be talking about it for a year. You know, they're just basically trying to sweep it under the surface. So you can kind of imagine things that might have happened there that we may never know about.
And people in the Soviet Union, they had no other source of news than state-run media. So it's not like they had any CNN or Fox News or anything to go on there and hear the other side or really question any of these things.
No, and I think just Chernobyl. You wonder what the average Russian even knew about Chernobyl, if they knew anything about it. Like before the internet, it's probably harder now. But still, if there's, you know, some small nuclear accident out in Siberia, do you think it's going to make Russian state television? I doubt it, unless it actually is such a disaster that, you know, someone happens to catch it on film and that ends up on the internet. It's just a totally different culture. And I bet there are some broken arrow stories that we'll never know.
Well, yeah, and I'll give you a recent example of that. Is they had a fire on one of the back of their, I think it was on the back of one of their kilos. And it was on the surface. It was in port. It was just moored to the pier, and there was a big old fire in the back, and it had all this black smoke, and people took pictures of it. And all these people sitting out there like, yeah, there's a submarine on fire in this port, and they were like, no, it's a drill. They don't worry about it. Don't worry about all the black oil and stuff all over the water that's obviously on fire.
Right.
Yeah, it's just a fucking drill. Don't worry about it.
That was in Vladivostok, right?
Yeah. They've had a few like that. Right.
And then you and I actually been talking about the Kursk a little bit. So a little bit of the changing in cult, I guess, after the Soviet Union collapsed, it started to be a little more open, started to have a little bit of freedom of the press. When the Kursk sank, you know, Eric, we were talking about that with the lady. I believe it was a mother of one of the submariners.
Yeah,
they actually sedated.
Yeah.
And it was caught on television.
Yeah, they came up. They did this kind of like town hall thing where they were out. They were kind of releasing to the public, like, "Hey, this is what happened to the Kursk." And one of the moms got up and she's like, "You know, you guys let it." And she was just screaming at him in Russian. And you can watch the video online. It's on YouTube. And if you know, make sure you watch the original one. Don't watch the movie. But you just see her screaming and she's crying, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of people that kind of walk up to her and they grab her real tight, and there's a guy behind her that just kind of whispers to her, and she just kind of falls asleep. And so you find out later on that they had actually, you know, they were known to do this a lot. You can go online and find multiple stories of how when people would get out in public, there would be a group there ready to sedate you in case you got too loud in their public meetings.
Like chloroform?
No. Like they would inject something into you. Like they would just kind of sneak up behind you. They'd stab you with something, and then they would walk off. And you can actually see her do it.
Right. Yeah, you can see the needle.
You can see the needle go in, and so, you know, they stopped her later on. And they're like, you know, what happened? Why did they do that to you? And she was like, they basically said, you know, no, it was for my heart medication. Like I had heart problems, so I told them in case I got up and started yelling at them to give me this shot.
My heart
medication. That was her story.
I mean, and that's Kursk, so we're talking like 2000. That's like modern era post-Soviet Union. Although I'm not sure how much more open it is under Putin, except that he has to pretend that it's kind of open.
Right. We're in this weird kind of in the middle gray area where it's not completely free, but it's not the Soviet Union anymore. But there is still a grasp on the media and trying to control what gets out.
I mean, and that's a terrible story because, I mean, Eric, I'm sure you know as well as me, that's Putin's disaster. The Kursk. I talked to a guy who was on the NATO sub-rescue unit who told me, like, we were there and we were in position to respond, and I think we could have gotten some of those guys out, but the Russians told us to stand down. Like, Putin refused to accept aid. And you'd think that would bring down anybody. He seems to. I guess he suffered for it somewhat, but he's still in office 19 years later.
Yeah, and I think it's a good segue. We were talking about lost nukes and stuff, but imagine how many lost reactors are out there, right? And so, we were talking about accountability and stuff too. I think we wanted to talk about Komsomolets and the tragedy that went down there. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's like the Kursk. We all know about the Kursk, or those of us who are like old enough to pay attention to the news. And was it 2001?
Yeah, it was 2000.
Right. Yep.
But that was on like front page of the New York Times because, like we were just saying, like post fall of the wall, post Soviet Union, Russia, it's not quite what it was. Like news is getting out, and because that one happened out essentially in full view, and there were NATO units around, and people tried to respond. It was pretty public, but the Soviets lost numerous submarines during the Cold War that did not become news. Yeah, and so you're talking about K-278, the Komsomolets, which was I think 84, was the deepest diving submarine on the planet. So, I don't know. You're probably not allowed to tell us what crushed up this for U.S. submarines, right? That's classified.
That is classified.
I think I think the publicly released figure is usually around 1,000 feet, right?
That's a good guess. It's a good guess.
Somewhere around there, around 1,000 feet. But
he can neither confirm nor deny that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll go with that. There you go. But it's a good guess.
I'll take that.
And didn't that come from Project Azorian? Didn't that statement actually come from that?
Yeah, actually did. The phrase "neither confirm nor deny." It's known as the Glomar exemption. So yeah, I'll detour into that quickly before I get back to Komsomolets. Yeah. So basically, when the story leaked to the media, a Rolling Stone reporter tried to FOIA information out about Colby's conversations with various newspaper editors. Basically wanted to know like how the CIA had squelched the story. And this gets back to CIA legal department. And the FOIA requires a federal agency to either release documents or to not release them and explain why they cannot be released. And like the most common response is like for national security reasons or whatever. But when the story is exposed, the CIA decides not to comment at all. I mean, it's great speculation that there's some kind of back channel negotiations between Kissinger and his counterparts in the Soviet Union. The Soviets are kind of embarrassed. They don't want the story to become public. CIA president obviously want it to kind of go away because they don't want. I mean, you can imagine the crisis it could spark. Like, you tried to steal one of our submarines. That's arguably an act of war. It's pretty close. CIA wants it to go away. Soviets want it to go away. So they're like, we're never going to talk about this. We will not acknowledge that this ever happened. So the legal problem that the CIA has is like, well, what do we tell this reporter? We're not going to give her the documents she wants, obviously. But if we say you can't have them based on national security, then we're admitting that it happened. And our official stance is this did not happen. We did not try to do this thing. It never took place. So this lawyer at the CIA, sits there and comes up with this phrase, well, we can neither confirm nor deny. Now it's like the biggest cliche in the world. Every publicist, it's used in all kinds of totally benign situations. It's a joke, basically. But that's called the Glomar exemption. It's still used to this day and often challenged in court. We've had a case up here in New York where the NYPD was trying to use it. And sometimes it works. Sometimes reporters or news organizations will say that's bullshit. We're going to take you to court and force you to either defend why you're using that. And in some cases, judges say it's okay because they're gonna end up revealing information by even saying that it didn't happen. It's like a revealing by not saying anything, as opposed to leaving it totally gray and being like, yeah, maybe we know something, but we might not. Anyway, known as the Glomar exemption.
That's it. I did not know that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, so that happened in 75, I believe, or 76, right in the wake of the exposure of the mission. So yeah, that's like maybe one of the most little known and most consequential things to come out of this operation. I mean, to this, like, I didn't actually use that phrase now as a segue. It's just like so in the lexicon, we all use it.
Right.
Anyway, yeah. So to go back to Komsomolets.
Oh, real quick though, before we get to that, I do have one more question I was interested in about K-129.
Yeah, sure.
Well, what are your thoughts on the rumors that how they said they only recovered part of the submarine was actually a cover story of a cover story, pretty much, and that they actually recovered the entire submarine? There's a lot of rumors about that. What are your thoughts on those?
I mean, I wish that were true. I think that would be the most brilliant. I would love someday to find out that that's true. That it's like, the reveal at the end of like Usual Suspects, where
right,
like you rewind all the things that you've heard about it, and you're like, oh shit, right, like they fooled me, and actually, like the submarine is intact in some mountain at Area 51. The reason I don't think that's true is because I talked to so many guys who are on the boat, and they weren't military or intel guys. They were just contractors or even like roughneck types. And for them all to be still coordinating their lives in a really precise fashion 40 years later, I just find it really implausible that somebody wouldn't have talked, or the stories I'm being told are not true. The pictures they've all sort of described the wreck in the same way. So I just don't think it's true. I'm not going to say it's impossible. Like I said, I kind of wish, I would love someday for that to be true. I could write a new ending to the book.
Yeah, that's that's interesting, because that's why I love reading into conspiracy theories. Now, I don't believe any of them. Like JFK, I was just talking to Eric. I've been reading a lot about JFK recently and the assassination. They're fun. They're interesting to read through. But I think you're right. I think just over the years, secrets are so hard to be kept secret, especially over all the years, especially when you have all these people involved, and for nothing to ever come out. Right. Yeah, I don't think that's very likely.
Also because, over the years, the repercussions have lessened. So it's sort of like revealing that now isn't going to create some huge conflict with the Russians. It's not going to restart a war. Yeah, granted, it would upset a lot of people at the CIA who are like all in their 80s now. So I just think it's super unlikely. I will say that if there is a conspiracy theory that's more likely to be true, it's that possibly the cause of the sinking of the K-129 was an accidental collision with a trailing U.S. submarine.
Right. Yeah, I was going to bring that up too.
I don't have any reason, like factual basis on which to say that did or did not happen. I mean, people who are on this mission swore to me that they don't think that's what happened, that they did not see damage to the submarine that necessarily indicated that was the case, but it was pretty badly damaged on the floor of the ocean. I doubt anybody did up-close forensic inspections. Again, I guess the most compelling argument against that would be that you're talking about a conspiracy that's been protected for 40 years. In this case, on the Navy's part, I do think it's possible that if it happened, the Navy kept it a secret, did not ever tell the CIA, which would be a whole shitstorm if that was revealed, because the CIA would be like, wait a second, you knew what happened and you sent us out into harm's way. And like, what if that came out and our guys are on this ship and like, you kind of put us in a really bad situation. But I think it's possible, like if a small enough group of people, like maybe just the crew of that submarine and some people at the Pentagon were aware of it, I think you could keep that secret possibly. But I still think somebody would have leaked it by now.
I want to disagree with that. And the only reason I disagree with that is because whenever the submarines get hit, there's always evidence of it, because there's nowhere to really hide American submarines. We don't have underwater bases to like just hide them in for a year to refit them and just act like they never got hit. Like you would, not only would the crews eventually say something about it, but I think that the actual, you would find evidence, you would find like photos of this submarine pulled in, where you're like, oh, well, just randomly the submarine pulled into Hawaii last week after they said it happened, and then it really starts to make sense. That's when all the collisions really start to make sense. But this one didn't have anything like that.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like so the Russians. This is the conspiracy theory that's very common in Russia to this day. They'll still tell you this is what happened, and they've I can't remember the name of the sub. They've like tried to pinpoint. There was a submarine that went into a port in Japan some days later with some kind of damage, but the math has been done. Like, there's no way it could have gotten there in that amount of time, and also the damage to the sub. I think the damage was to the sail in that case. And the theory about if this were what happened was that the U.S. sub overran the top of the K-129, so the damage would not be to the sail of the American sub. It would have been to the somewhere on, I don't know, the bottom of the front. Certainly not on the sail. So that submarine has essentially been discounted. So you're right, Eric. I mean, it means that the damage to that sub would have had to have been repaired somewhere, and it would have come in off of it would have been an unexpected port call, right? It's not going to go into dry dock randomly without somebody noticing.
Yeah, definitely. And they're not going to just let that go. Like, it's not just going to skirt off something and the Navy's going to be like, just don't worry about it. It's going to be good. Let it go for 6 months. They're going to pull that thing in pretty quick to make sure it's not going to do. I mean, because the bottom is that's a real tender part of the submarine. That's where all the tanks are. That's where you got all the piping and discharge stuff. All the stuff under the water is really important.
Right. And like, that conspiracy theory has like kind of metastasized to, there are people who think that that's why the Swordfish sank, right? That the Soviet retaliated in the Atlantic for us accidentally sinking their submarine, and that we've been covering up that sinking because we sunk theirs, so they got to sink ours, right? That's where that theory has gone.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the Scorpion, but yeah, definitely.
Sorry, Scorpion.
Yeah. I mean, the Scorpion's it's the same deal. There's no real evidence of what happened, which more than likely it was just a torpedo that malfunctioned and exploded because those batteries are ridiculously crazy. But, I mean, you can throw whatever story you want there because there's no way to discount your story. So
right, and the nature of submarines and sub warfare is so secretive. Everybody thinks that there always is stuff going on that we don't know about. That's the whole nature of the Navy won't even tell you when a sub is leaving port, even though you can stand in Groton and watch the subs come and go. You can't call the base and say when is the North Dakota leaving? They'll never tell you that. Where is North Dakota going? We won't tell you that either. When's it coming back? Your guess is as good as mine, right? And that's not the Jimmy Carter. That's just a regular attack sub. It's also secret, so you can kind of project whatever you want onto it, I guess.
So the other thing that was brought up with the conspiracy theory that they actually did recover the entire submarine, and maybe you know more about this and you can dispel this right here and now, was the ship's bell. Now, supposedly they said the ship's bell was in the conning tower of the K-129. And the part that they recovered did not include the conning tower. So was that just an incorrect facts? Did they not recover the bell, or was it in a different section? Or
yeah, they did get the bell. So I mean, you're right. That's a little mysterious. How did they get the bell if they didn't get the tower? Maybe it collapsed down into the portion that they got. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. But yeah, I mean, unless that is a lie too, that they didn't actually get it. I mean, the story goes that they did have the bell that was given back to Yeltsin after the wall fell in '92, I think. DCI Gates, later Defense Secretary Gates, became the first CIA director to go to Russia. So after the wall falls, he goes there. He takes the video of the funeral I was talking about earlier, and he takes the bell and a few other things, and he gives it to Yeltsin. And that's kind of when the story goes public in Russia as well. So you're right. I mean, why would they have the bell? I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, one of the things about this story is I feel like I found out more than anyone else has previously. I talked to more people who were on the mission and knew about it. I still don't have a lot of answers. Like, I can't tell you definitively why that thing sunk. I can't tell you exactly what they recovered. Am I sure that they're not lying about some small or large part of it? I'm not. And I think, we may never know the answer to these questions, because I think those people who know the answers, there may not be many of them who are still alive. Like, a lot of those people are taking them to their grave, probably. I did, like, for instance, the son of one of the CIA officers who I befriended afterwards told me that his dad became obsessed with the collision idea. And he was like, going to try and prove that there was a collision that the Navy had been covering up. And, he died before he could prove any of it. But now the son sort of feels that that's the truth. And, how do we ever get to those answers? I don't know that we can or ever will. It's not like, I doubt there's some secret video out there that's going to just be leaked one day, or that the submarine is in some box at Area 51 and they're just going to, release it to the public one day. Like, here it is. This is what we got.
Yeah, it's right next to the Ark of the Covenant from Indiana Jones, right?
I mean, I do kind of think of that sometimes when people are like, "Where's the stuff?" I'm like, I don't know. Do we have like a big secret warehouse in a mountain where there's like, you can go in and there's like all the stuff that you're right, like the Ark and the UFO guy, the little alien that top.
Oh yeah, yep, Roswell crash.
Yeah.
I would like to find it and go there.
That would be incredible. You would have plenty of material to write a few more books on then, huh?
Yeah. So I wish I could answer the conspiracy theory. They're fun to talk about, and they're not totally uncredible. There's some of them are credible, at least to the extent that they could possibly have happened. Like, could there maybe have been an accidental collision that was covered up? Yes. Could it, even if it's unlikely, could we have gotten everything and created a second lie? Yeah, I guess so. I don't believe that it happened, but it's possible, And I should say there's one more conspiracy theory, which has actually appeared in a fairly successful book that came out about 10 years before mine, which was that the K-129 was a rogue submarine that had been taken over by a KGB team that wanted to start World War III, and then it was surfacing to launch its missiles at Honolulu when some kind of accident occurred and it sunk. Now, like, a published book by a major publisher actually put this theory out there, and a lot of people believe it. I mean, I still get emails about this. Every time I've given a talk, somebody's asked me about this. And like the problem is, like, and this one I feel like can be refuted with facts, is that for that to be true, the submarine would have had to surface within firing distance of Honolulu. It was well outside the range of those missiles. So where the accident happened was about 1,500 miles north and west of Honolulu, which was more than 500 miles outside the range of the missiles. So clearly that is not what happened. But what the book did is, I don't know how, but he moved the location of the wreck like 500 miles closer to Hawaii.
Well, there you go. That is convenient.
But I have declassified memos from the AFTAC meetings that show exactly where the sub sank. I've got guys on the ship who told me, this was pre-GPS, but they had a reading on where they were. It definitely was not in the place that it would have had to be to fire the missiles at Hawaii.
Interesting. Yeah, that they carried those R-21 missiles, right? I have it written down here for my research preparing for this podcast, 1,500 kilometer range. So yeah, 3,000 kilometers to Hawaii. It's about 3,000 to Alaska. It's kind of deep in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, far from anything else.
Well outside the range. Now, I think, one of the, and maybe the most plausible answer for what happened, and this is what the former chief acoustic analyst for the Navy, he's written some papers about this. What he thinks happened is that, because it happened at a precise, we're talking like intersection of two round number, latitude, longitude, almost on the hour. So it seemed like a planned surfacing for something, right? In a location at a time that were essentially round numbers, accidents don't happen on exact moments at round numbers, right? Like,
Right.
planned. What he thinks is that it was like going through a test fire drill, that it was surfacing to sort of go through the practice of what we would do if we were going to launch, and that during that process, something happened with one of the missiles that actually caught fire in its tube. And so the warhead didn't detonate, but the fire inside the rocket fuel actually burned to exhaustion and breached the hull. And that would have caused the sub to fill with water, which would explain why it didn't completely implode and was relatively intact when it hit the bottom.
So it happened almost exactly on the international dateline, did they call it? Right? 180 degree.
Yeah, and I forget, I used to know the coordinates, whatever it was, like 1800, 400 or something.
Yeah, 8.
Is that right?
Right, yeah, so 40 degrees north latitude and then 180. Exactly 40 and exactly 180. You mean a little bit off, but that could be drifting.
Exactly, slightly off, and essentially on the hour. So, accidents don't, random accidents don't occur at precise locations on the hour.
Right, yeah, the odds of that happening are extremely low.
Yeah. So that's, you could find, the guy's name is Bruce Rule. If anyone was interested, you can look him up. He's written some papers about, and he describes in pretty great detail. And he went and found, like, what would the duration, how long does the fuel burn on an R-21 and SSN-5? I forget what it is. It's like 2 minutes burning to fuel exhaustion. And then he looked at the acoustic anomalies on the data where it said, like, we heard something at this minute and then this minute and then this minute. He basically figured that would have been the duration of, like, the missile burning to fuel exhaustion and then a breach of the hull and then, something else. I don't have all this committed to memory, but it's easy to find. So it's a pretty compelling argument laying out how it could have happened.
It always does amaze me. I mean, Eric knows a lot more about this than I do. Just sonar in general, how much information you can get out of sound, stuff like that, right? Like they can identify what an object is making sound in the water from hundreds of miles away, even.
Oh yeah, that was the whole point of the SOSUS, was they could identify the sound. It's the sound of the propellers, right?
Yeah, well, it's just really the sound of anything out there. They'll listen for anything, so they'll listen for implosions or, the sound of the propeller is where you get the real detail of what you're trying to listen to, because that's the noise it makes all the time. So it won't necessarily be a propeller. It could be a pump or something that constantly runs all the time that you can pretty much know that that's what that noise is.
And isn't it like basically every propeller has a distinct signature? So the U.S. Navy back then was like essentially could identify that's the K-129 and not the K-278.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Because every submarine is built differently. It's built to go faster or slower or be more secretive or whatever it is. And so they'll put different props on them with different blade rates. Or with different numbers of blades, and then they'll put in, let's say like a propeller hits something, or it has a little nick, or maybe they knock it against the pier one time. Well, that you'll always hear that sheek 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 sheek. You'll always hear that propeller blade making that one distinct noise. So if you always hear that, you always know it's that one submarine that's going out there.
It is pretty amazing. So we've got like some like acoustic analysts just wearing headphones sitting in Alaska in the Aleutians, probably just like listening to data, thinking like that's that sub and that's a whale and that's like I don't know, it's an underwater volcano.
Right. Yeah. Hunt for Red October type thing.
Yeah. Now imagine now they're throwing in AI and they're throwing in machine learning and stuff. I mean, who knows what they can hear out there now.
Yeah. Do all that automatically.
But I feel like SOSUS is how isn't it right? That's how we found out what whale sounds were. Wasn't it SOSUS that discovered whale sounds?
No, I'm not sure about that. I don't know. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, I think that at some point after late when SOSUS was declassified, they started releasing data. And I think scientists started using it, and I feel like they used it to figure out what whale sound. They were able to hear whale sounds and identify what they look like. I've definitely seen a story about this in like Nature.
Well, definitely, and I know that a lot of those underwater hydrophones are owned by NOAA and scientific organizations out there actually just doing research.
Yeah, because I think we've moved on to second or third generation now, so the original ones probably aren't that useful to the Navy.
Yeah, I mean that stuff's old 70 stuff by now.
Yeah, it's actually, I should say, for acoustic nerds who might be listening, that there's this the sort of most common story about 129 is that it was SOSUS that identified the acoustic anomalies that located the wreck. It was actually something called AFTAC, which is the Air Force acoustic system that was anchored alongside SOSUS, which was to listen for ICBM splashdown. So when the Soviets used to shoot their missiles off into the Atlantic, we would like listen for them to come down, and I think probably in some cases go and try and grab them. So it was actually SOSUS didn't hear it; it was AFTAC, but they're mounted side by side on the seafloor.
Interesting. All right, well, we can get to we can move on, I guess. I think that's everything with the K-129. Learned some pretty cool stuff. So the other interesting one was the K-278.
Oh yeah, so we were talking about this. Yeah, it's another wreck that's sort of fascinated me. And not a lot of information is out there, but in '84 the Soviets lost this. So it was a titanium hulled. It was meant to be the deepest diving submarine. Oh, I know how we got in this sidetrack. So Eric was not confirming that in general U.S. subs aren't going below 1,000. And then certainly they're cruising much shallower than that typically. This one was capable of going to 3,000 feet. So substantially deeper, and it was meant to be basically the unsinkable submarine. And of course, it's basically like the Titanic story in a submarine. The unsinkable submarine sank in '84, and it's an incredible story because the world didn't really know about it for reasons we discussed earlier. The Russians just did not talk about their accidents. They didn't ask for help. This was not only the deepest diving submarine. It actually had. It was the first submarine of its kind to have an escape pod. So because it was going to dive so deeply, the portion of the tower was designed to be an escape pod, so that if some percentage of the crew could actually get into this pressurized escape pod that was supposed to launch automatically at certain depth. I can't remember exactly what that depth was, and it would essentially shoot them back to the surface, and they would survive even a catastrophic accident of the sub sinking. So basically, when this sub caught fire, the captain surfaced as he was supposed to, managed to get a lot of the crew up on the deck, and then ultimately into the freezing cold Sea of Norway, I think it was. It was extremely cold, hypothermic waters. But a lot of the crew got off, leaving only a few key crewmen below trying to put the fire out and save the sub. And then a small percentage of them end up going down with the sub. And I think 6 of them make it into the escape hatch and actually shoot back to the surface. When it hits the surface, a couple of them are ejected out of the hatch and die anyway. One person survived, the only man in history ever to go to that anywhere near the depth, and I think it was 5,000 feet, and back and lived to tell the story. This Ukrainian guy who was then sort of like shamed out of the Russian military because the Russian, they were terrible about these disasters. He should have been, I mean, not a hero, but at least like a folk hero kind of. He survived, and the crew. I think about half of the crew were able to get out and survived. A bunch of them drowned or got hypothermia, died of various injuries, and then everyone else that was in that capsule that came up did not survive, including the captain and the XO. But this one guy, he was a reactor officer, or a reactor engineer, sorry. He survived. He's actually still alive to this day.
Interesting. Eric, any thoughts or questions on that?
No, man, I think it's a super interesting story, and I think Komsomolets is really interesting too because it was titanium hulled. That was when they were really starting to push the limits of this new metallurgy, and titanium was still new, especially when it came to submarines. They didn't know what they were doing with that. It's like trying to say now, we're trying to make a carbon fiber submarine, for military purposes. Like, sure, Ocean Gate's built a fiberglass submarine, which is great and it works, but they're not shooting torpedoes at each other with them or anything like that. So it was just this crazy new technology, and I think that's where ultimately it was kind of a weird failure because they just went out in a fire. You know what I mean? And then they just kind of they just surfaced and they kind of everybody died in they still had this amazing submarine that probably just some random outlet just lit fire and just caught this random lagging on fire. Next thing you know, their whole thing's just completely, useless.
Right, and it wasn't a failure of the titanium at all. In fact, I think the integrity held up, as it was sinking through thousands of feet. I don't think they imploded because obviously the escape capsule got launched at some point from thousands of feet down, so it hadn't imploded to that point. So the titanium probably held up. But you're right, it was it wasn't that. It was just a fire, which is fire is your worst nightmare, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Besides flooding and sinking and never coming back, yeah, but yeah, definitely.
I mean, titanium is, we just have never had the forges. The U.S. never invested in titanium, and if we're gonna talk a little bit about the Skunk Works here in a minute, this was always a big problem from Kelly Johnson's perspective, was that the U.S. never invested in titanium forges, and the Russians did. I don't think we couldn't have made a titanium submarine because we had no way of forging pieces big enough to make one. And meanwhile, they built this gigantic thing that was going to go to 3,000 feet. They also went bankrupt. I mean, a big reason that the Soviet Union fell apart is because I think we bankrupted them in the arms race. They they couldn't keep up, and things like the K-129 got in their head, and they spent money on stuff that was just enormously expensive because the public had there was no accountability. That they were just build bigger, faster, stronger. Who cares if the plant blows up? Eventually they go bankrupt, but they did some amazing things too, like building this titanium sub. I mean, I don't think, has anyone built anything like that since, Eric?
No, I mean, it's arguable that we still haven't caught up to that age because we just never really did anything with it.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, the Five Deeps thing, the Triton, that's a titanium pressure vessel, but it's tiny, it's like a little sphere. And even that one, it was barely fit inside the world's largest pressure testing vessel. It was just small enough to fit inside the only pressure tester on the planet that could simulate full ocean depth. So
yeah, definitely.
We're talking about technology that still hasn't really advanced.
Yeah, and it's crazy too because, man, 3,000 feet or 3,300 feet, it's whatever it is. Let's say 5,000 feet. That's crazy. That gives you such a huge advantage as a submarine because you can go deep enough to where the torpedoes can't get you. You just run deep, and that's what a lot of them do. If you're at periscope depth, you just run deep, right? That's kind of the whole slogan, right? And you just get down there fast enough to where the torpedoes can't get down there fast enough. But if you can just go so deep that the torpedoes just literally can't go that deep because they're just not designed to, that's a game changer. That's a huge game changer, and we have never really dealt with that. I mean, I couldn't honestly tell you what NR1 was made out of or what the Jimmy Carter's made out of. I mean, sure, it could be made out of titanium. Nobody knows. I have no idea, but I would imagine that I don't think we've ever really dealt with it, especially in the submarines. I think maybe with aircraft and stuff, but not submarines.
Yeah, no, and I don't think Jimmy Carter's going to 3,000 feet. It probably does a lot of crazy shit that we don't know about, but I don't think it's going to 3. I don't think we have the capability to build that kind of pressure hull. And probably the reason the Russians haven't done. I mean, it's got to be just massively expensive and so complicated. And it just, I guess, we've realized yeah, we could maybe do it, but it would cost us God knows what, and we'll seek advantages in other ways. We'll have, we don't necessarily need to get down there because I guess we're managing to stay hidden anyway.
Yeah, I mean, if it's going to double your price and all you get is a few more thousand feet, maybe it's not really worth it.
Right, especially now. I think a few years ago, we were probably thinking like we don't have to worry about the Russian submarine fleet anymore. But now,
Right.
like Putin has like really dumped a lot of money back into it, and they're starting to get they're getting feisty again.
Well, I think the big scary one is China because they've got the money. I mean, you could talk about Russia all day. They got the motive and they got the motivation, but China's the big bear that we don't know about,
It's
and
a
the
new
one
kid
that
on the block.
none of us really know anything about. Yeah, and it's so hard to find information on them. Nobody really knows what's going on, but we know they got all the good stuff.
Yeah, and they're good at stealing technology.
So I guess we can change topics. Good segue into that would be titanium with the SR-71, right?
Yeah, so my next book is going to be about Kelly Johnson and the Lockheed Skunk Works, which kind of spun out of this one because Lockheed built the claw on the Glomar Explorer. So Clementine was a Lockheed Ocean Systems project, but actually the Skunk Works kind of consulted on it. So yeah, I'm going to write a book about the history of that, which actually started with the XP-80, America's first jet fighter, but most famous for the U-2 and especially the SR-71, obviously like everybody's favorite. Like if you go to the Air and Space Museum, the only aircraft that have like their own fanboy section. The space shuttle's got one, but there's a huge SR-71 section. I mean, people love that plane.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's fun. I've seen a few of them. So they have one where you are in New York City in Manhattan, right? Isn't it on top of the Intrepid, or is it
Yep.
an A-12?
Yep. You know what? I can't
Similar aircraft,
remember.
same.
Well, yeah, one A-12 was a one-seater. The original CIA plane, the SR-71 is the Air Force, the two-seater. I can't remember exactly whether it's. I think it's an SR-71 in New York. There's an A-12 outside CIA headquarters in Langley, but then there's Air and Space has got a 71, the one in Dulles.
Right. And there's the one in Dayton, Ohio, the Museum of the Air Force.
There's one in the like Virginia Design Museum.
I saw another one in LA, the Science Museum, I believe. They had it out. They just have it out front, like in the parking lot. You'd miss it. You can easily miss it.
And then if you go to Palmdale, there's actually a like a Blackbird graveyard there near Lockheed's headquarters now in Palmdale, California. You can see a couple of them. Yeah, I mean that's incredible. I mean, going back to what we were saying about graph paper and like 19. So that project, the SR-71, began in 58, I think. So basically, the U-2 was flying. Francis Gary Powers gets shot down in 60, but because we knew that they were tracking the U-2 and like slowly building up to shooting it down, the CIA had secretly begun a plan to build something even more unstoppable. And they figured they started with radar cross section. So stealth begins in 1956, essentially culminates with the F-117 in Iraq first Gulf War. But they're working on stealth, but they realize we can keep getting better at stealth, but we can't make it invisible. The only way we can stay safe, because the president is only directive from the president, and that's Eisenhower at that time, is we can't get shot down. I can't start an international incident. You can overfly Russia as much as you want, but you can't get shot down because then we're in trouble. And they started seeing that the U-2 was vulnerable. So Kelly Johnson at Lockheed ran the Skunk Works, says, okay, I built you that plane. I can't make it invisible. I can make it partly invisible, but I can make it really fast. It will fly really high, and there's no way they'll get to it. So they began the project of designing the SR-71. And in 2 years, they designed a Mach 3.2 airplane that flies at 80,000 feet, built out of titanium, using essentially they invented every part of it. It's just a mind-blowing feat of engineering, and it was done in secret.
That is incredible. I mean, nowadays it seems like they've been working on different aircraft for a decade, even longer. 2 years, you said? That's it?
Yeah. So the U-2 took 8 months. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. So the U-2 took 8 months. The SR-71 was flying in 2 years. Now, it wasn't operational for 5, I think, but it was flying in 2. Yeah, I mean, compare that to the last great Skunk Works plane in the sense that it was really built in secret and, in the model that Kelly Johnson started in the 50s was the F-117, which also was, it flew, I think, in 2 or 3 years. It wasn't operational for like 14 or something. But like, look at the F-35, amazing plane, Lockheed's latest. It was like almost 20 years, I think, wasn't it, for operate? They were like, I think the prototype flew in like the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Here we are. We're finally going operational this year.
Yep. Well, and then there's other stuff too. You think it gets easier with computers and technology, and you can simulate a lot of this stuff. You can do it a lot quicker than having to have to build all these models of it like they used to. But it's gotten so much more complex because all these complex, all the software you have to write to run the F-35, to operate with all the electronics and the sensors on it, it's just become so much more complicated. I don't remember the exact number, but I think they said there was like 30 million lines of code in the F-35 that all had to be written out for it to run.
Yeah, I mean, one of Kelly's most famous phrases was "keep it simple, stupid." They built like mind-blowing stuff, but it was always like, if we can use something that already exists, let's use it. Like, and one of his dictums before the SR-71 was one miracle per program. Now they totally blew that open with the SR-71. I mean, they were inventing everything. They had to like create their own tooling, and the hydraulic fluids and the fuel, everything was like never been done before. But still, it was all achievable. They were able to do it in 2 years. Yeah, I think technology really changes that. He would also tell you when he died, I forget what year he died, in the 80s when he was an old man and, a consultant, had been phased out of Lockheed and was giving interviews finally because he really didn't ever talk to the media in his working lifetime because he couldn't. He was just talking about like, it's not just technology, it's the Pentagon. It's the way that we acquire weapon systems now, and how many flag officers are involved, and how many committees, and how many, you've got so many cooks in the kitchen. His thing with the CIA, well, he liked working for the CIA, was like one point of contact. Like, I only have one person who I answer to. Everyone's and within my shop, everyone's accountable to me, but I deputize all of my department heads to make decisions too. And we all get together once a day and we lay, these are the problems. We make a decision on the spot, then you go and fix it. I don't want to have a meeting about that thing unless you can't fix it. That's just not how it works now. It's just like layers upon layers of bureaucracy and so many people who don't want to get in trouble for making the wrong decision. And we still make great stuff, but it takes so much longer and everything costs so much more. I mean, how many B-2 bombers did we build?
Yeah, like I think it's 20 around there.
And how much did they cost?
$2 billion each, I believe, around there. Yeah.
I mean, we made, the SR-71 flew in 2 years, and he made, I think the contract was, you're talking, it would have been hundreds of millions in today's dollars.
Right.
Like he had 20 of them flying in 5 years.
And then the interesting thing was, you were talking about titanium. They actually were purchasing the titanium from the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah, well, they started with American titanium, and it wasn't good enough. There weren't enough people making it, and the quality wasn't good enough. So yeah, the CIA found a way to use like a series of shell companies to buy it from the Soviets, which is just an amazing thing that we were able to pull that off. And that became everything on it was titanium, like I forget what the value of the bolts, because they realized like even the tooling, when they would use their old drill bits, but drilling into titanium was different than drilling into steel, and everything would fail after a certain amount of time, so they had to redo all the build new drill bits. Everything had to be basically 100% of that airplane had to be invented. And look at it today, like people still, lust after it. It's like an object of worship 40 years later.
And how many rumors? There's been countless rumors about the SR-72 that is supposedly in development for the last 40 years, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, he got asked a lot late in life again, like how much higher, how much faster, and he was sort of like, well, I don't think that's where we're headed for a couple of reasons. One, satellites obviously have filled a lot of the need that thing was created for, but also, he thought like unmanned aircraft is the future. He was saying this in like the early 80s, by the way. Like, one reason we make it so fast and fly so high is to protect the pilot. But if the future is unmanned aircraft, like that's not going to be as much of a problem. They can fly in different ways to be undetectable, and also if they get shot down, it doesn't matter as much. So
Right.
we may never see anything like it. I don't know.
And that's what they've been talking about, making the SR-72 be unmanned.
Yeah, and they were playing with that. The SR-71 had the D-21 drone that flew off of it. They were already realizing like maybe we could fly this thing with so we had a supersonic drone that launched off the mothership and was designed in parallel to the SR-71. I mean, again, early 60s. But the problem is that in testing, it separated and crashed, like ripped the tail off of a plane, and one of the navigator and back was killed in the accident, and they ended up scrapping. And then they moved to the B-52 as a launch platform, and then they kept losing them over China, and they scrapped the program.
Yeah, and didn't the Soviets actually get their hands on one of them?
Yeah,
it's called the D-21, right?
Yeah, the D-21.
Yeah,
you can read a lot about it because the NSA just a week ago dumped a whole bunch of declassified D-21 docs.
Oh, interesting.
So anyone who's interested, the program was called Tagboard. And I forget how many thousands of documents a week ago were declassified. A lot of it was already out there, but they just dumped everything they had, so you can read about it.
Interesting.
Well, and you guys were talking about high flying flights, but I think that the X-37 was probably what took over that, right? Which is those unmanned space vehicles.
Yep. Yeah. Totally.
Let's see. So we have the SR-71, and like we were saying, the F-35, even the F-22, the U-2, F-117. They were all built at, in case someone doesn't know, a place called Skunk Works. That, and I don't know, you want to tell them just the basic idea of it? It's a top secret facility where everything is built in complete secrecy, right?
Yeah. Basically. So, I mean, it started kind of by necessity because when at the end of World War II, Kelly Johnson was then he was not the chief engineer, but one of the chief engineers at Lockheed. They were like going like crazy for the war effort, building the P-38, the B-17, the Hudson bomber, all kinds of stuff, just like as fast as 93,000 employees, like just, and you can't even imagine, like just, I think they're building 28 planes a day or something absurd, just like, your grandma and the 7-year-old and like the building, all we can do. But so the Pentagon starts freaking out about the Germans having a jet fighter, and they say like, we need a jet fighter. And maybe this guy at Lockheed is the one who knows how to do it. And they ask him to do it. When he goes back to his management, they're like, well, okay, you can take a handful of your best guys, but we can't afford to we can't stall the production on anything else. You're going to have to figure out how to do it on your own. You can take the guys that you need, but you're not using our line. So it's a crazy story. They took a bunch of old Wright engine crate boxes that were going on some of the B-17 bombers, and they built a factory and put a circus tent on the roof. And he promised the Air Force that he would build them a jet in 180 days, and he built it in 143 days.
Wow.
Wow.
And that became the model for this like top secret small team of really smart people, basically all the resources that you need. So money is no object. Very few people, extreme need to know. Like even within Lockheed, people are like, we don't know what Kelly's doing in that circus tent. And then once they had a prototype, they moved it up to Edwards and started testing it. And, unfortunately, or I guess not unfortunately, we won the war. We didn't need it. Only 4 of them made it to Europe in time for the end of the war. But by that time, the Germans were fading anyway, and it didn't turn out that we needed it. But that plane, F-80, became a big fighter, first ever air-to-air combat kill by a jet over Korea, and then was like a major jet throughout Korea and even after Korea. And then from there, they built the F-104, and then the U-2, and then the Blackbird. And then Kelly Johnson retired in the middle, right before the F-117 and his deputy took over. I would say that's the last plane that was built using the original Skunk Works model, which was extreme secrecy, very small group, very rapid decision making. kind of making the impossible, miracles happening on a daily basis. It got a little bit more bureaucratic from there, but it still exists. It's now called Lockheed Advanced Development Projects. And yeah, they built the F-35, and they're surely making something that we don't know about. Lots of stuff we don't know about, probably. It just doesn't quite work the way it did back then, which was like, okay, we're going to build you a jet in 180 days. Well, I'll build you the U-2, a high-altitude surveillance plane that's going to fly 30,000 feet above the highest Russian missiles, and I'll give it to you in 8 months. Or I'm going to build a titanium airplane that flies Mach 3.2 in 2 years. Just like miracle after miracle. So I'm going to do a book sort of about the halcyon days, like why it came about and what it did, and kind of what that means for every tech company in the world now claims to have a skunk works. It's become like a cliche. It's like the secret place where we do miracles with our smartest people.
Yeah, it's I actually took a cross country trip a few years back, and so I flew to LA. And then was driving to Vegas to meet my friend who flew into Las Vegas there. And I actually drove out of my way so I could drive past it. You can't see much, but you can see the skunk on the side of the building there. It says Skunk Works out there in Palmdale.
Yep. It was originally in Burbank. So the site of the Burbank airport today was the original. That was where Lockheed's headquarters, and then that's where the Skunk Works was. Yeah, and then they moved out in the 70s. They moved out to Palmdale, and yeah, the skunk, they adopted the skunk eventually. It was originally a name that Kelly hated. It was based on this Lil Abner. I guess it was essentially where they made moonshine out in the woods in this little Abner cartoon. And no one was allowed to, when the guys answered the phone there was only one telephone, and whoever was nearest answered it. But no one knew what was going on in there, and you weren't allowed to say what it was. You just had to kind of, answer and say whatever you wanted. And one guy, as a joke, just started saying, "Hi, or you've reached the Skunk Works," which was just this joke from Lil Abner, and it got back to Kelly Johnson, and he apparently hated it, but the name stuck, and eventually the guy who drew Lil Abner cartoon threatened to sue Lockheed for copyright infringement, so they had to change it to Skunk Works. So it was originally Skunk, S-K-O-N-K. Became Skunk Works, and they designed a logo, and now it's like, one of the most famous names in defense contracting and just technology engineering.
Interesting. So you're in the middle of writing that book now?
Yep. I wish I was in the middle. I'm probably more like in the first third of it. It's due a year from April? A year from May. So 13 months it's due. Okay. So yeah, I'm fairly far along, but it's a little harder in some ways because it's older story. There aren't as many guys alive. Even though I was already running into. I spent a lot of time in retirement homes reporting the last book, with like CIA officers living in, the deserts of Arizona and Florida and California. This one, most of the people are no longer alive, but there's actually more in the public domain now because Oxcart, the SR story has been declassified. The U-2 has been declassified. Almost all the F-117 stuff is declassified. So it's a little easier in some respects, but harder because there aren't like personal stories that are, I always want to talk to someone who was there if possible.
Right. And maybe that's a good segue. I was going to ask you later on, but what is the research process like? So if you're about to write a book or begin the research, what kind of steps do you take? Obviously, you go interview all these people.
And I want to add on to that real quick because I was going to ask the same question generally, but specific to like CIA documents and stuff that's like heavily classified. Like, I've always wanted to just go on the CIA website and just see all the new stuff that they release, but I don't know how to do that. Like, I don't even know if that's even a thing. Like, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, actually, though, you can do that because the CIA has got
that reading room.
The reading room, yep. And you used to have to go. So the CIA database is called CREST, C-R-E-S-T, and you used to have to go even after everything was digitized. You had to go to the National Archive in College Park, Maryland, and use specific terminals at the library to access the CREST database, which was a huge pain in the ass. And I guess maybe it was so they could closely monitor who was looking stuff up. But you can only get declassified stuff anyway, so it's sort of silly. Last year, they finally put all that on their website. So now you can literally go in there and just type in words, that you're looking for. But that doesn't mean it's there, and you have to know how to search for it. With something like Azorian, which was declassified in 2011, but only some things. They put out like an internal history and some engineering stuff, but not a lot of it was declassified. So you can file for FOIAs, and I did some of that to not great success. I just more chased like the human. I tried to find people who are still around, and because the program had been declassified, people were kind of comfortable, or at least less uncomfortable than they would have been. I think if you're trying to talk to people about it, well, you would know. You're like, there's classified things you can't ever tell anybody, right? Like, and I think you're not going to convince somebody just because he's 80 to start telling you classified things. But if the story is declassified, there is some gray area stuff where they're like, no one ever told me that I can or can't talk about that, but it seems okay to talk about it. It becomes like a judgment call, kind of. But then there were other times where they would definitely say, like we were talking about the nukes earlier. It's like, that's a very clear line where someone would be like, yeah, I can't, I'm never going to be able to explain to you how a nuclear weapon detonates, or like what we use to detonate a nuke, or even, I'm not even going to really speculate with you about what the Soviets might have used, because by telling you that, then I'm kind of telling you what I know about what we do,
Right.
But if it's like things about a mission that happened in 1974 that's been highly classified, but now the agency itself has declassified the whole mission, if I tell you about things that I saw on there, I don't feel like I'm violating a secrecy oath. So that turned out to be helpful, and most people were pretty, I don't want to say eager to talk about it. In some cases eager, like definitely there were people, I think, who probably felt like they were never going to get to talk about it, and it's kind of liberating, it's fun. I'm sure there's things Eric knows about subs that if someone said, like, okay, you're free to talk about it, it's kind of fun to talk about it because you've never been able to, and they're like, this is cool. I can like tell my neighbors what I did. But the hardest people are the security guys. Like, even if it's declassified, if your specific job was security, then I just think it's so hardwired into you to not talk about it. Your entire existence was protecting secrets. Literally, that's the definition of your job. You're not just an engineer who wasn't allowed to talk about the stuff. Your job was like building the walls and protecting those walls. Those guys still, even on declassified stuff. And I'm running into that a little bit now, even with some guys who worked security at the Skunk Works for CIA. It's like, the SR-71 program is in the wide open now. There's not any secrets about that anymore, but they're still not. It's like antithetical to them to feel like, okay, I can tell you about the way I did my job.
So you mentioned FOIA. That, if you don't know, it's the Freedom of Information Act, right?
Yep.
So you can submit these Freedom of Information Acts requests for pretty much anything, right? And then they decide whether or not it's okay to release it, and they'll make redactions even if they do find paperwork that they can release.
Yep.
And then they'll mail it to you.
And you don't have to be a journalist or
anyone can do it.
Any citizen can do it. And it's the backlog is, Trump's cut the budget in most agencies for it, so it was always slow. It's gotten slower, and some agencies are notoriously difficult and will almost make you sue them, because they can deny you, and then you can sue them, and often suing wins. You can often win in court because they'll try and say that they're protecting some secret, but then if you have to go in front of a judge and argue why that's actually, why this secret from 1972 is still important, it's pretty hard to make that argument usually. But most people don't fight it, and I actually didn't sue. I just didn't have the money to hire a lawyer and do it, but I think probably I could have gotten more stuff if I had. I don't think there's a real defensible argument for sources and methods in a lot of these cases.
Right, and that's one of the main excuses or main reasons they use not to declassify some of the stuff, because it's going to reveal yeah, right.
With Intel especially, yeah, sources and methods is the thing that they will always tell you, which is sort of, it could be anything. They might say it for how we concoct, how we came up with a cover story, or a lot of it is like procurement and contractor relationships and stuff. Like, that's the stuff that gets heavily redacted. Certainly anything about like agents or spies, double agents, and how information is conveyed. And actually, some things with the Glomar Explorer, like how were communications conducted. They had various ways of sending messages in the black, but they had to do them in a way that they weren't detectable by the Russians. So that like you're using like, secret codes in the gaps, for instance. Like it's the spaces between the words that mean the thing, not the words. So if you're listening to the messages, they're saying, hey, it's the Glomar Explorer, and I'm, just calling in for a weather report or whatever. When you've prearranged ways to communicate in secret, then you can say like, these are the kinds of things that I'm going to say, and this is what it's really going to mean, right?
Right.
But that's the kind of thing where they're not going to tell you. They'll say like, yeah, we were hiding messages in the open, but they're not going to tell you this is how we hid the messages, right? And that's the kind of thing that they're probably never going to tell you even 40 years later, because even if the radio signals have changed or it's digital now instead of analog or whatever, like these probably things they were doing then that they're still doing today. Code is a real important thing. And that's something that's closely guarded, and you'll never get that out of them probably.
So when you're beginning the research on a topic, will you go on like the CIA's that reading the page there and try to just start looking up for any keywords you know of? Because I've gone through there sometime, and you search for specific keywords, and I tell you like 90% of the documents you find are nothing. It's just a waste of time. You download the PDF, and it's just like 5 words about some small cable they received from Eastern.
Yeah, it's totally useless. Yeah, a huge percentage of what's on there is like, yeah, you're right. It's like a 1-page memo, which is like, from one program member to another with a bunch of redactions, and there's absolutely no information in there. So, yeah, it's pretty hard. I mean, with something like the SR-71, which the program was known as Oxcart, like you could spend weeks in there just going through the stuff. In a case where something is pretty well known and a lot of it's been written about before, what I tend to do is go and read everything else, and then use, like, if you look in the sources in the back, you can kind of see what the original primary source documentation is, or you'll find like dates and names. I'll search like, or there'll be key officers whose names you may not have known, and then you go in and search for that person's name, or you search for a meeting that took place on that specific day. But it's hard to just go in there right from the beginning and just be like, okay, I'm just going to try and find everything I can. It's almost impossible, I think. So like in the case of the Skunk Works, like there's so much out there already, and I just read everything I can find, and I'm kind of highlighting and looking for names and dates and places, and then looking at their source material and saying, where did they find this stuff? And, I'm pulling the original documents. And then with Azorian, it was a little harder because there wasn't a lot of stuff that had been written, and there's not a lot that's been declassified beyond a couple like main documents. So I wasn't able to get a ton out of the actual CIA program or within their declassification system. There just wasn't a lot. That was more about doing interviews and finding people. In this one, I'm actually finding tons on there, maybe too much. Like, yeah, if I just were to search like Oxcart, I bet there are probably thousands of documents, and 80% of them are going to be cables that are useless.
Right. So how do you find the people to interview then? You can keep your sources and methods redacted. You don't have to give away all your secrets, but like if you're trying to find a CIA contract or someone who worked on K-129, for example,
it was a little bit of like telethon. You kind of start with a couple. Like there's people who've been named in the previous. There was a hour documentary done. There was a book by one guy who was on the mission. You can kind of start with a few people, and they usually lead to a few other people. It's kind of like, once people trust you, you say, who else can I talk to? I had a fairly good relationship with the CIA, so I actually went to them very early and told them about it. And it's not like they were helpful. They didn't like endorse it or really give me anything, but they didn't stand in the way either. So I think if it was a case of someone who was retired from the agency, I think I could say, you can check on me and just ask them, like, here's the public affairs office. I have worked with them. They know who I am. I'm not like sneaking around trying to, it's your own decision whether you want to talk to me or not. But like, this is like a legit thing that is happening out in the open. But it was really like, making a couple connections that lead to a couple more, that lead to a couple more. But I would also, I would do things like find people. I mean, I don't remember how many people, but I remember finding people on like Amazon comments where someone would be like reviewing a book that was relevant to it. And they'd be like, I served on, I did this job for this contractor, and I would just find them and send them an email, or I knew who and I knew who the contractors were. So like, the naval architecture firms, and I could call them and they would send me to their, it's a lot of grunt work of just kind of like chasing dead ends. I cast a really wide net, and the research I spent 3 years on that book, so it's not like it had to all be done in a month. And you're never gonna, I think there are national security reporters, and that's all that they do, and they spend a lot of time cultivating sources, and they actually have people who like still work, and maybe give them non-classified information, but like we'll talk to them on background, or like I don't have those kind of relationships. I'm not like a deeply sourced national security person. That like takes, you have to live in Washington and make that your life. Like I think it'd be really hard to write about contemporary covert projects.
Oh yeah,
you just have to know people who are willing to trust you, and I'm not going to burn somebody, but I also understand why they're not going to, like, they don't know who I am, and it's a real leap of faith to talk to somebody, even on background, about secret stuff. So I have a lot of respect for people that do that work. It's really complicated and hard, and difficult to walk the line between what's okay and what's not okay. I feel pretty comfortable with like 40-year-old programs.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. It's a lot. 3 years of research. So it's just phone call after phone call, and that's interesting. You find people in internet comments. Have you ever came across somebody who's just making it up? Because on the internet, people will claim anything.
Yeah, no, because I think in all the cases of people I've reached out to, I could tell by the things they were saying that they knew what they were talking about.
Okay.
So no, but I mean, I've certainly heard from a lot of people since then who don't know. Like once the book comes out, I hear from all kinds of people, and often there are people who don't know what they're talking about, who claim that they know something and they don't actually know anything. But yeah, it's just slow grunt work often. It's a lot of reading, and then like thing about reading, you learn like names and dates and locations, and those are things that you can then go and take to like Crest or to other research databases and look when like on this date something happened and these are the names that were there. Then like often you can kind of find something that might be valuable, as opposed to just showing up with a search bar and just trying to type words into it like that. Yeah, like you said, that often yields nothing but a waste of time.
So it's just a bunch of finding a few names and then cross-referencing that data you find, dates, names, with other databases, and you find a few more, and then you go back to another database with that information. How do you know when you're done?
Well, in the case of like book publishing, like if I have a book publisher that tells me when I need to be done, that's the biggest answer to that question. But also it's just like, it's a kind of diminishing returns at some point. Like, we were talking earlier, there's things I would like to know the answer to, and that maybe in some cases I could get a few of those answers if I kept working. And you just have a sense for when there's enough done to tell the story in a satisfying way. I didn't feel like there's huge questions that I could answer by working harder. They're just questions I can't answer because that information is either classified or lost to time. But yeah, like there's a ticking clock, which is your publisher telling you, okay, I need this on this date. And then there's like the personal, like, okay, I could spend another 6 months and I'm not, maybe I'm going to move the ball another 2 inches, not 200 feet. It's like, that's not worth it. It's just time to move on to something else.
That makes sense, yeah. So I guess the last topic I have here that we talked about before we started recording was you've written about the DMZ axe murders back in 1976.
Yeah, so this one falls under the category of like things that almost started a nuclear war too, right?
Right.
Yeah, like I think a little known story that along the DMZ, this tree. I mean, literally, it was a tree that needed to be
It is such a strange story. It really is.
I've said that like it should be a Coen Brothers movie because it's so absurd, but it's also like it's maybe as close as we've come to nuclear war in the last 30 years that nobody knows about. Yeah, I mean, the short version is there was a tree blocking the line of sight for American guards of North Korean guards in the DMZ, where we have this Panmunjom, we have this small area where U.S. and South Korean guards stand basically side by side with North Korean guards, and it's fairly nonviolent and innocent, except it's also very tense because the bitter enemies for all these years, and this was in the 70s when tensions were still pretty high. But like war doesn't break out there. They managed to like get along without necessarily killing each other. But this tree was being a problem, and the Americans and South Koreans said we need to trim this tree because we don't have a view, very good line of sight, and we don't consider it to be safe. And the North Koreans stepped in and said, well, you can't cut that tree. You're not allowed to do that. So tensions start to rise, and the Americans are like, well, we're going to cut down the fucking tree. Well, we don't really care what you want. We're within our rights to do it. And they go out and they do it, and this fight breaks out. And the North Koreans actually beat 2 American soldiers, officers, both of them officers, to death with axes and axe handles. And sparks this massive international incident in which, like, I mean, cooler heads prevailed at that time. Like, it didn't erupt immediately into a shooting fight, which could have easily turned into a battle, which turned into a war, which turned into nuclear war. I mean, both sides kind of broke away, backed off. And then the U.S. government, I mean, we're talking all the way up to the president, just sort of like, we can't stand for that. Like, they just like brutally murdered 2 American officers over this stupid tree. We need to make a stand here and like make a symbol out of this. And the decision that, you know, they consider all these eventualities and possibilities. What they say is like, if nothing else, we're cutting that fucking tree down.
They even called it Operation Paul Bunyan, right?
They did, yeah, Operation Paul Bunyan. And so they concoct this elaborate plan, you know, on its most pedestrian level. They're just going to go and trim the branches that they started out. But this time they're going in with like South Korean commandos. And, you know, I should say within the DMZ, there's very specific rules of engagement, and you're not allowed to carry, you know, only sidearms and no rifles. And so they actually kind of abide by that rule in that they've got a bunch of weapons on trucks outside the DMZ, but the group that goes in is essentially like South Korean commandos, you know, Army engineers, some Army backup with some rifles hidden under the benches, and then just sidearms. But beyond that, you know, we're talking like mobilized, the entire 8th Army mobilized, B-52s flying overhead, you know, like, I mean, full force of the United States. Basically, we're going to go in here with handguns and pickaxes and ninjutsu experts, and we're going to cut this tree down. And if you guys get in our way, like, the entire might of the United States is going to turn North Korea into a parking lot. You know, like, and this is literally where, you know, so for a moment there, they go in and they go to cut the tree down and trim it, and everyone's on edge. And, you know, and the North Koreans are across the river panicking. It's sort of like, you know, what could have happened in some of the other things we were talking about earlier. It's like if one of those North Koreans decides to take a shot, which turns into a firefight, which turns into a battle, then, you know, you got B-52s flying overhead. World War III breaks out, all because of this tree. Fortunately for history, the North Koreans didn't react. They kind of panicked. And I think we're well aware of, like, okay, this could get really bad really quickly.
It's just a tree, too.
Exactly. Do we really want to have, you know, our entire country obliterated over this tree? But it's, you know, it's another thing like Azorian where it's kind of been lost to history. And it was this moment where we came very close to an incredibly large and disastrous war. And over the pettiest thing possible.
Well, so I just pulled it up here, just a Wikipedia article. It says that North Korea was claiming that it was a tree that Kim Il Sung planted. So I guess that's why it had a little bit more meaning to them.
Who knows if that's true is the thing. It's like, I think that they were claiming that, but what I was talking to guys who had served there, and they were sort of like, they would just do whatever they could. The North Koreans were just like kind of petty and difficult, and they would always be annoying in ways because they knew that American soldiers were very law-abiding and strict and respected the rules that they were supposed to abide by. Like, this is a very tense place. We have to act the way we're allowed to act. And it's an elite group. You know, you're chosen to serve there based on like having a perfect record and being a good soldier and being over a certain height because you had to look intimidating because Americans are generally taller than Koreans. But the North Koreans would like, you know, spit on their shoes and call them names and like just kind of be dicks about stuff. So I think that, you know, maybe they were making stuff up about the tree to justify the fact that they'd done this.
So there's a couple other funny things I found here. So a General William Livesey, he was the commanding general of the 8th United States Army in South Korea during this incident. Actually, I'm sorry, shortly later, 1984 through 1987. I guess he made a swagger stick carved from the wood of the tree and carrying it around.
I believe it. And like a bunch of guys had like things made out of the wood. Yeah, like it became like a big souvenir. Although some of the like veterans of the operation joked to me that like, you know, if everybody who claims to have a piece of that wood like is actually then like the tree would have had to be like 500 feet tall. Like they think that probably stuff has been made that wasn't actually from that tree. But for a while it was like a huge souvenir to have a piece of it. And, you know, guys have it mounted on their walls. And, it's like a very funny story and kind of outrageous and unbelievable. But for the people who were there at the time, I think it was incredibly tense.
Oh, and right. And people died, yeah.
Yeah, certainly the guys who were there in the tree cutting group when those two officers were murdered or, you know, fully scarred by it, feel either responsible and also just totally outraged by the fact that it happened. But I think that, you know, it's kind of an amazing... shows how disciplined U.S. soldiers are that actually, you know, went down without starting a massive war, I think, because it could have escalated numerous times and did not.
And there's been a lot of incidents like that on the peninsula there that have gotten real close. I mean, major things. So, for example, not too long ago, just a few years ago, there was North Korea torpedoed a South Korean naval ship that sunk. There's been numerous times where they've fired artillery at different South Korean islands.
Yeah, well, but going back to right before Azorian, 668 was the Pueblo, which right. They stole a fully captured a U.S. Navy recon ship and surveillance ship, and like still have it to this day. I think it's still sitting in a harbor in Pyongyang or wherever. Yeah,
they show it off to anyone who comes to North Korea. It's always on the YouTube videos of, you know, Vice, or they go to North Korea. It's a tourist site. They have a museum of it, and they talk about American imperialism, and yeah.
Well, I know they on the Glomar Explorer that, you know, there's still talk that, you know, one of many motivations for wanting to get the K-129's crypto gear was that the Soviets had clearly would have gotten a hold of whatever was on the Pueblo, would have been turned over to the Russians or to the Chinese, who would have shared it with the Russians, and also, you know, some revenge for that probably. And the security guys on the Glomar learned some things because Pueblo did not destroy all of its classified documents fast enough, and I think so on the Glomar Explorer they designed like rapid destruction processes for what happens if we get boarded.
Interesting.
Wow, that's interesting.
Because you see it in movies, right? Like, what was the movie they made recently about the Iranian hostage crisis? Argo, yes, yeah. So anytime, you know, like when the embassy was under attack, they were quickly trying to go through and burn all the documents they have there.
Yep. Yeah, they designed a thing on the Glomar Explorer for I mean, obviously rapid shredding, but they also had essentially like chutes that would go straight to the ocean, but they had to be in like a steel mesh bag, otherwise it's not going to sink. So they have special bags designed that you put, like shred the classified documents in, burn them if you can, and if you can't, put them in these steel cages and drop them through these chutes, and then they sink to the bottom of the ocean.
And that is in case those Soviet ships came and boarded it.
Yep.
Yeah, and that probably came from submarine design, because that's how you get rid of the trash. You just put it, they call it the TDU. You take the trash and you wrap it in these like steel cans, and then you compact the trash on top of it, and then you have to weigh it. And if it doesn't weigh so much, you have to put like these big metal pucks on it to make it actually sink.
That doesn't sound very eco-friendly.
No, definitely not. But you can't hold trash either, so you gotta do what you gotta do.
Can't you burn it? No, you can't burn it, I guess.
No, fires are bad.
No fires there. No fires.
No fires on submarines.
And then you flush your crap gets just flushed out, right? Vacuum flushed out into the ocean.
Oh yeah, theirs do now. The Virginia classes do, but no, we didn't have the vacuums back in my day. But no, you just blow it out to sea or pump it, whatever you gotta do.
Do they collect it? I mean, build it up for a while. I know it's not the nicest topic to talk about, but or every time someone goes, it's just flushed right out right away. Because you would think, I don't know if that would make any sound, or even the smallest.
Yeah, right. Is that right? Because I guess there's certain times when you can't flush the toilets, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, no, they have tanks. Like you just fill a tank up, and whenever the tank's full, you just blow it out. I mean, it's like any other tank. I mean, they do it with like waste oil and stuff.
But
like
even the
that.
sound of a flushing, or how does that even work? The plumbing.
Well, no, you don't have sounds of flushing. Well, I mean, maybe you do now because they have vacuums. But back in the day, you just had a big ball valve, and you open it, and it just like fell into a tube, and then you close the ball, and then you just fill it with salt water. So I mean, there was no noise. The noise came from dropping the toilet seat. That was a big deal. So you'd have to, if you're going ultra quiet or you're going on a mission or whatever it was, you would tie strap the toilet seats up so they wouldn't fall and bang on the toilet bowls.
That's right, because you can't if you're in ultra quiet, you're like not allowed to make any noise, right?
Yeah, definitely. Any of those noises will get you found.
Like, what if can you like not cough or sneeze if you got a cold?
No, I mean like actual just noise through the air is not gonna make a difference. But like if you were to drop something and it made a big bang noise, it could make a big difference. That was when submarines started to get a lot more quieter because they started putting sound mounts on stuff, right? So they would put rubber mounts, and so the decks would actually be floating decks. Like they wouldn't actually be attached to the hull. They would float on rubber or whatever it was, and that would keep the sound from reverberating out, and it made a big difference. But like when we would go against surface ships and they would suck so bad they could never find us, they would literally make us go down in the torpedo room and grab a hammer, and we would just bang on the bottom of the ship like a boom, 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 come find us, boom, 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 and they would still never find us. It was crazy. Yeah.
Don't they the ships are supposed to have like hydrophones hanging underneath them, aren't they, so they can hear you?
Well, yeah, supposedly they're supposed to have like full active sonar and stuff, and I don't know, they just have a tough time.
All right, I gotta run in a few minutes here, guys.
Okay, yeah, we can wrap it up. Anything you'd like to promote while you're on? What's the name of your book, the K-129?
Taking of K-129.
That's pretty easy to remember. The Taking of K-129. It'd be an interesting book. If anyone's interested in reading or hearing a little bit more about the topics we covered. Anything else you have?
I'll be working on this. I don't have a title for the Skunk Works book. It won't be out until 2021, so that's not worth promoting much right now. Look out for it in a few years, a couple of years, I guess.
Maybe we can have you back on then.
Yeah, definitely. You're right for a lot of different stuff, too, like GQ and Men's Health and stuff like that, so I'm sure we'll see you all over the place.
Yeah, I'm around in the meantime. I still got to make a little bit of... They don't pay me enough money that I can't stop working on everything else, but that's my main project. But yeah, I don't have a story to promote at the moment, but you'll see me around.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Any other questions, Eric?
No, man, I think I'm good. That was awesome, man. I had a really good time. Thanks for joining us, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. All right. Well, that's the end for today, and we'll see you guys back here next week. Thank you.
Cheers.
Tech Ops is owned and operated by hosts Eric M. and Greg R., along with producer Kyle Smith. Copyright 2019. Music by Kevin MacLeod, Twisted. Creative Commons 3.0.